Alright, so we're here in 3ds Max, and I just finished rendering out those footage frames, and so what we can do now is start to set up our scene right here in Max so we can get to work creating some boss muzzle flashes and all that jazz. So with that said, one quick thing to get out of the way real quick. If you are completely new to 3ds Max, then I recommend you check out some online tutorials. Autodesk, the manufacturer of this software, has some great beginner's tutorials that kind of explains how the software is laid out. So with that out of the way, let's start configuring stuff. So with this main viewport selected, I'm going to hit Alt-B on the keyboard, and this is going to bring up my configuration panel. I'm going to check Use Files, click on Files, and I'm going to find the footage that I want to use. Alright, so once you've found that footage, just click on the first frame and make sure the sequence box is checked. That way it opens all of the frames rather than just one. And we can hit Open and OK. And then we can also check the animate background. That way the background follows along as we scrub through the timeline. We can say Apply to Active View and OK. The next thing we have to do is configure the aspect ratio of our viewport, because I can tell that some of the footage is being cut off. So what we're going to do is go to the Rendering tab, go to Render Setup. So under the output size, we want to change this to HD, which is the aspect ratio of my original footage. So there it is, HD, and cool. Then once you're done, we can close that. Then we can click Perspective and Show Safe Frames. And that's going to correct the aspect ratio and make everything look nice. Alright, so with all that set up, now we can actually start creating the cool stuff, which is the muzzle flash. And for this, we're actually going to be using a plugin for 3ds Max. It's called Fumefx. So I'm going to click in the left viewport here. Let's see, I'm going to hit Alt-W to expand it to full screen, and then I'm going to hit P, and that's going to turn on perspective mode, and so now we can kind of see things in 3D. So now what we want to do is create what's called a Fumefx grid, and so we're going to go over where it says Standard Primitives, select Fumefx, click the Fumefx button, and draw out a container here, or a grid as it's called, something like that. And we can tweak this later, but basically this represents the area that's going to be simulated by Fumefx. So Fumefx actually has basically just a bunch of algorithms that you give it settings on regarding fire and smoke and how you want it to look, and then it physically simulates fire and smoke that sort of pertains to those settings. That said, you don't want to make this grid so large that it's calculating a giant area, because that's going to slow your computer down. So you want to keep the size of this container in a reasonable range, and I think something like this is pretty good. Alright, the next thing we have to do is create a source for our fire and smoke. So we're going to go to the Helpers tab, go to Fumefx, and we're just going to create a simple source. And zoom in here, just click and drag, create one, and right click when you're done. That's going to finish the creation process, and now we can just kind of orient this thing here. So I'm going to rotate it. And actually, I think I'm going to make this source just a little bit smaller, so I'm going to go into the Modify tab and turn the diameter down. Also, by the way, I'm going to be doing all of this stuff in feet, or American units. The way you can change your units is you go to the Customize tab, Units Setup, and then you can change between US standard, metric, or custom units. So I'm going to be using decimal feet for this, just so you know. Alright, that looks cool. So let's go ahead and select our Fumefx grid, And I'm basically going to be explaining the settings and what they do, what they control, but I'm going to be ultimately leaving the final result up to you. So just keep that in mind. So let's go ahead and open the Fumefx UI by clicking the little blue cube. And here we go. Here's the user interface. And every setting that pertains to your explosion is right here in the UI. So first let's start with the most important setting, and that is spacing. And this refers to the resolution of your explosion. So if you turn the spacing up, it's actually a lower resolution, but it doesn't take quite as long to simulate. So you can think of the spacing size as like the size of pixels on a screen. The larger the pixels are, the rougher and more jagged the image looks, but the easier it is to create, I guess. There's less data there. A good little numerical reference for how long, the simulation is going to take is the little sentence down at the bottom that says sim up to, and right now it says 1 megabyte, which is an extremely low resolution explosion. So if we turn the spacing down, that number starts to go up. For me, I'm going to keep this around 160 or so. I have a fairly fast computer. We're going to hit the simulation tab, and this is what brings up all of our settings for the actual simulation itself. Let's see, we have the time scale, so we can animate basically how fast the explosion is, I guess, relative to time. We can adjust, gravity, vorticity, which is sort of like how much the smoke sort of bubbles and curls and whatnot. So if you turn the vorticity down, it looks very smooth. If you turn the vorticity up, it looks a little bit more turbulent. So personally, I like a little bit more vorticity, and I think with a high-speed muzzle flash like this, you're going to want, more turbulence in the smoke and fire. So I'm going to turn the vorticity up, and I'm also going to turn the turbulence up a little bit, maybe 0.005, not very much. It's a pretty strong setting, so you don't have to turn it up very much to get noticeable results. And then under the turbulence noise, this is basically the map that Fumefx uses to add turbulence to the simulation. So I'm going to turn up the detail of this map to 5, so we get maximum detail on our turbulence. And then I'm going to turn the scale down. Cool. Let's see, what else? Yes, fuel. For this, we can turn the burn rate down a fair bit. So right now it's at 30, and that's going to burn out fairly quickly. So I'm going to set this to something like 7. And under the burn rate variation, I'm going to turn this up to 1. I think some of these are fairly self-explanatory. The heat production, we can probably leave where it is. The expansion, we can set to maybe 2. And then finally, down at the bottom, one important setting that I'll explain a little bit later. Under the extra detail tab, we want to switch this from none to wavelet turbulence. And this is going to be basically a way to add extra detail. Again, I'll explain it a little bit more later. But now it's time to actually try and simulate this and see what it looks like. So we can go onto the Object Source tab. We can click the Pick Object button, click on the source, and now we have our source listed and all of the source settings right here. So what we want to do, because this is, after all, a muzzle flash, is we want to animate this so that it, burns for a short amount of time and then stops emitting fuel and smoke. We don't want this to continually burn. So what I'm going to do is use auto key down here at the bottom. So what we can do is we can actually turn the smoke down to 0. Well, actually no, I take that back. Let's leave it at 2. But we do want to animate the fuel. So I'm going to go forward to something like frame 7 and turn the fuel down to 0. And you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and simulate this to see what it looks like. So let's click the green little button up here, the arrow button, and that's going to start the simulation, and we can see what everything looks like. Alright, so I simulated just about 40 frames or so, and as you can see, it's far from looking like a muzzle flash. And by the way, to open up this little output preview, as it's called, you just click the little picture frame button in the top left corner of the UI. For one, the smoke is rising, and we don't want that. Just physics-wise, we don't want a lot of rising apparent in our slow motion muzzle flash. So that's probably caused by the temperature, because heat rises and it's taking that into account. So we can turn the temperature of the source down to 0. So that will hopefully take care of that problem. We can also go back into the sim settings. We can go down to the smoke, and we can turn the smoke buoyancy down to 0 as well. So hopefully this will stay, you know, flat and even. It won't float or sink. Cool. And then let's see, one other thing. Oh yes, one other thing. We want to increase the velocity of the fuel as it exits the source, and the way to do that is under the velocity box in the source settings. We can turn the directional velocity up, and that's basically going to increase the force at which the source emits fuel. Let's try and simulate that again and see if it looks any better. Alright, so I simulated about 60 frames here, and if we scroll through, we can see that this actually looks quite a bit better. Just physics-wise, we have our smoke going in a nice straight line. We also have some nice turbulence, so we get a lot of nice detail in these smoke clouds, and it's looking good. However, it is far from finished, and it does not look anything like my original muzzle flash. So we can keep playing with these settings. One really important thing that I forgot to mention earlier is that if you turn the temperature of your source down to 0, you're probably not going to get any fire, and that's because Fumefx fuel requires a certain amount of heat in order to ignite, and I forgot about that. So we're going to go over to the simulation tab and set the ignition temperature down to 0 so that it will ignite at any temperature including 0, and that's going to reintroduce fire back into your simulation. And then we can also play with the time scale to make this a little bit more dramatic. So I'm going to set this to something like 2.5. I'm going to turn on auto key. I'm going to go forward to about frame 10 and then turn this down to 0.8. So the explosion is going to start fast but then slow down over time, and it's just going to give it a little bit more of a dramatic effect and going to be a little bit more similar to a true slow motion muzzle flash. So just keep playing with these settings and keep doing a couple of test simulations and find something that you like. Alright, so once you have something that you're happy with, then it's time to create basically a production quality simulation. So what you want to do is go over to the General tab, and right now my simulation is set up to a size of 124 by 242 by 104. It says sim up to 209 megabytes, so it's a decent resolution, but we want to turn this up to where it says something like sim up to 350. So anywhere between 300 and 350 is a pretty high quality simulation. It might take a while, but it's definitely worth it. So go ahead and once you're happy with all that, go ahead and click the simulation button and get a sim that is fairly high quality. Alright, so once you have a simulation that you like and something that is fairly high quality, it's now time to do the wavelet turbulence pass. And this is a relatively new feature. I think it came out in Fumefx 2.0. But basically what it is a secondary simulation pass that can double or triple
the amount of detail in your sim. So just going to show you how to set this up. It's fairly simple. What it does specifically is it actually adds a little bit of turbulence, hence the name, and it creates like these little bubbles and swirls and stuff, as well as boost the resolution of your sim. So under the strength settings for the fire, smoke, and fuel, you can adjust basically how much turbulence is added to each channel. So I'm going to turn the smoke strength down to maybe 1, but leave the fire strength up. And then under the grid detail scale, this is basically how much it increases the resolution. So a value of 2 will double the resolution, a value of 3 will triple, etc. So I'm going to turn this up to something like 2.5, and as you can see, under the size and the sim up to setting, it says sim up to 2686 megabytes. So it's going to be a very high quality output, and this whole second pass doesn't take very long. So with that said, go to the sim mode and click wavelet, and then click on this new start simulation icon, and that will start the wavelet simulation. Alright, so with the wavelet simulation finished, what you want to do is go over to the cache and change this from default to wavelet, and that's going to give you the full detail of your sim. The other thing is, if your computer is a little bit laggy with this output preview, you can turn down the quality. I had it at 5 and even my computer was lagging, so you can turn it down to 3. I guess it's 3 at default, so if it's laggy at 3, you can turn it down to 1 or whatever, just to kind of help your computer run a little bit faster. But now it's time to do one of the final steps in getting this to look good, and that is the rendering tab. So go to the rendering tab, and this is basically where we tweak the color of everything and kind of the aesthetic appearance of everything. So you'll notice I've gone back to my original viewport with the footage background in it, and I've kind of just roughly aligned my muzzle flash here so I can just kind of see what's going on. So basically I'm just going to be using this background footage as kind of a color reference. So first let's look at the smoke, and we're going to change the smoke color to something that matches gunpowder a little bit more. So under the color setting, I'm going to right click and change this to keyless mode, which is basically going to allow us, if we click on the color, it's going to allow us to just pick one color for the smoke, and it kind of just makes things easy. So I'm going to make it a little bit grayish and add maybe just a little bit of blue to it, and hit OK. And then what we can do is we can tweak the color of the fire, and the fire is a little bit more involved. So I'm going to scroll back in time here to where we get some fire. There we go, something like that. We can zoom in a little bit. Alright, so what we want to do is right click on the fire color and select key mode. And this is basically, when we click on this, it's going to open up a gradient. And this gradient basically is, well, you can think of it as like a color over time gradient. So colors on the right are going to be basically colors that are emitted by the fire early in time, and then as the fire burns out, it's going to be emitting colors farther to the left, if that makes sense. So when this muzzle flash first starts, we want it to be white hot, and it is right now. But as this burns out, we want it to kind of burn out into some yellows and reds. So what we can do is we can click or double click to add a key. We can double click on that little key and change the color. So I'm going to change the color to something a little bit more orange, maybe a little bit more red, and say OK. And then we can slide this key over. We can play with this other key here, make it a little bit more yellow. The key to this is basically just configuring these colors to where it looks natural. So just have to kind of play around with settings and get something that looks good. Alright, so once you have everything set up the way you like it, you can also play with the saturation setting next to the fire gradient. So I usually turn this up. You want to keep everything within moderation, but something like 1.3 works well. Makes the fire look a little bit more dramatic and kind of a little bit more hot, I guess you could say. Yeah, that looks good. Cool. So, the other thing you can play with is the smoke opacity, and this is basically how thick the smoke looks. So if you turn this up, you're going to get a very thick looking smoke cloud, like a diesel explosion sort of thing. And because there isn't much smoke emitted from a gun when it's fired, I'm going to keep this opacity where it is. Alright, so what we can do now is we can go to the illumination tab, and what we want to do is actually add a light to this. So I've already done this. I'm going to delete this light here. So what we're going to do is go to the lights tab, go to the standard, and create an omni light. And we can just click here, right click, and we can move this up. There we go. And just kind of position this where you want. Next we can go to the modify tab and set this up correctly. So what we want to do, turn the shadows on and make sure they are ray trace shadows. And then we can go to the shadow parameters and turn atmospheric shadows on, because 3ds Max treats Fumefx as an atmospheric effect and not geometry, if that makes sense to anyone. So what we can do now is go to the Fumefx UI, and we can, under the illumination tab, we can select the pick light button and select our light. Oh, the other thing we can talk about a little bit is multiple scattering, and that's basically where the fire sort of illuminates the smoke a little bit. It kind of gives it a glow, similar to what would happen in real life. And if you set this up correctly, it can look really good. However, if you don't set it up correctly, it can look kind of bad. So you can use this if you'd like, but you don't necessarily have to. I'm going to turn it on just because I can, and I've kind of set it up how I like it. Cool. So, let's see. I keep forgetting stuff. Let's go back to the UI. Under the rendering tab, we can go down to the smoke, and we want to check cast shadows and receive shadows. That way we get some shading on the smoke. And let's find a good frame. Yeah, that looks good. Cool. And then what we can do is hit Shift Q, and that's going to render a frame. Alright, so this is looking really good. We have a lot of nice detail here in this smoke cloud, so definitely worth the high resolution and the little bit longer simulation times for this extra detail. It really does pay off. So now it's time for the final step in 3ds Max, and then we can get to compositing in After Effects. So we're actually nearing completion on this effect. Alright, so now it's time to get to the final render for this muzzle flash, and then we can start compositing. So first thing I want to do is set up this render properly. So I'm going to go to rendering, render setup, and actually I'm using the default scan line. I know I told you to use the mental ray. You can also use the scan line. For some reason the mental ray was giving me problems with this screen recording software, so I'm going to use the scan line for now, but want to make sure that your output size is still HD. Let's see. The other important thing is under the Render Elements tab, we want to add elements, and this is actually a big concept, really, because when you're compositing 3D elements, you want to have a lot of control over them, because usually the color and the lighting, the shading isn't exact. So you have to be able to tweak a lot of different aspects of your CG element in order to get it to look really realistic. So what we're going to do is click the Add button, and we're going to add the Fumefx fire and the Fumefx smoke. And so what that's going to do is, as we render out our file, it's also going to save the fire as a separate video. So we'll have one footage layer where it's just the fire, and then we'll have another footage layer with just the smoke. So we'll be able to composite those separately, and we'll be able to control them separately. Alright, the next thing we want to do is switch the time output from single to active time segment. So we're going to render out 109 frames. And then finally, the last thing is we can go down to the render output, click on Files, choose a place to save. Alright, and I'm just going to call this Muzzle Flash. And I usually save it as an open EXR. This is kind of the industry standard when it comes to CG renders, just because it has a lot of bit depth and control. So we're going to hit save. It's going to come up with this little dialog box. We want to make sure that we have 32-bit per channel color depth. We also want to make sure, and this is very important, that your type is set to RGBA and not RGB or mono, because the RGBA includes an alpha channel, and that's obviously very important when compositing. So with that set up, you can hit OK, and finally you can hit render.